2012 was chartering that working group. We had Morteza Ansari and Leif Johansson as the chairs, and they're both on this call, and Morteza is up here on the podium, the virtual podium, co-chairing this one, as is Nancy Kam-Winjet. Thanks both of you for co-chairing, and thanks Roman Danilou for sponsoring this BOF. So the goal here is to look at what we did in the SCIM working group, update it, move it to internet standard, and do some additional things that are necessary. And we'll go over that all in the next hour. And yeah, we are at the top of the hour. So welcome to the IETF111-SINS BOF, which I keep thinking of Peccata Mundi, but I guess it doesn't work. Anyway, so let's go ahead and get moving. The note well, which most of you have noted well already, but note it well again. If you are unfamiliar with any of this, please read the relevant documentation that's referenced on this slide, and check with your legal team if necessary, if you have a legal team. So what we're going to do here, I guess I should turn on my video so you can get a picture of me. There we go. So what we're going to do here is each of these items on the agenda is roughly a 15-minute slot. We have an hour. Something going over the history, how we got here, and where we intend to go, the body of work going into a bit more detail on that, and then we will review the draft charter that's been floating out there for a bit and talk about the next steps and look at whether this BOF accomplished what it needed to accomplish. There's the GitHub link for the interest group that that has been keeping this afloat since the SCIM working group closed. And we have a mailing list, which is scim@ietf.org. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Wooler and Hunt. There we go, who are doing the What is SCIM. I guess Phil is starting us off because he has joined the queue. So go ahead and unmute and head forward.
Hi there, can you hear me? It's Phil.
Just fine, Phil. If
Okay,
you turn your video on, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, it's okay if you.
I think we're going to be a little bandwidth constrained, so in order for everybody to hear, I'll keep the video off. But
that works for me. Muting now.
Yeah. So what is SCIM? Let's just go back into the next slide. It started, I guess, not sure when it started, actually before 2012, as an informal project where people were recognizing they needed a way to pre-provision identities to major cloud service provider like Salesforce.com or WebEx and other services. This happened around a time when Roy Fielding's RESTful APIs were taking off. But I think one of the things that were happening was the most successful APIs on large scale were asymmetric. There was only one implementer of the service and many thousands of clients, and it worked quite well. What the market was seeing, the initial enthusiasts were seeing, is that Salesforce was going to go one way, VMware another, and so forth. And that was going to create a permutation and combination problem of having to create thousands of RESTful APIs. That just wasn't going to be the greatest thing. They also saw many different data formats emerging, and there was a need to sort of coalesce and evolve. So SCIM 1 came out, and it was done fairly quickly and fairly informally. There was a need immediately. Interop issues emerged because of things like data typing, agreement on data typing, uniqueness of attributes, mutability of attributes, and things like that. So the group came together and formalized, decided to formalize SCIM, which became the SCIM 2 initiative, started with Barry's help in 2012. We worked for 4 years, I guess, and we published in 2015. We introduced things like identifier stability, the notion that URLs don't change, they're fixed, agreement on SCIM filters that allowed you to query JSON structured documents, the idea of complex multi-valued attributes, which now allowed us to have equivalency to something as new and modern as vCards, where you could have multiple telephone numbers, where you have a home number and a work number and different things like that. That in comparison to old protocols like LDAP, which were just attribute pairs and very simple in comparison. We had an initial allowance for paging, but the paging we had was very simple. We did not want to have complexity there. We recognized that SCIM was going to be an API people would implement on many underlying systems. So you might have SCIM in front of a payroll system. You might have it in front of a contact management system. You might have it on top, and many have implemented on top of a directory. So there are going to be many different underlying capabilities. And you'll notice if you look at the spec that even the notion of a filter is an optional piece of SCIM. So there is a fair amount of variability and capability across the implementations that are out there, but at least we have a common data format and a common protocol to work with. And I think that's another characteristics of SCIM, is that it is first of all, it's a profile of HTTP, which is broadly capable, but it's a profile because it combines a JSON document format that go together, and that can create its own error signaling and formatting problems. Another part of the philosophy that SCIM had was to try and be robust. Now, I know that's a tricky word in the IETF these days, but the idea was that when you're going cross-domain, not every attribute is of interest, for example, to every domain. But we don't want to make the client developer's life a nightmare. So if you send an attribute that the service provider isn't interested in, it's free to ignore that attribute. So the key always is, as with TCP/IP it was, if you understand what you've got and you're sure of what you've got, you're okay to proceed. So SCIM2's protocol does have a fair amount of flexibility to it, and we have had some success. The question now that we're here today for is what about SCIM3? So next slide. Before I go further, this SCIM structure is that we talk in terms of resources. The spec defines RFC 7643 defines two main resources, users and groups, and then an extension which demonstrates how you can extend a user for enterprise claims. SCIM's schema structure is not schema in the XML sense. It's really there to tell a generic document handler what are the claims and attributes you expect to find in this document and where to go look for them, so that there's some consistency. And the schema extension mechanism allows for local customization and an easy way to separate the standard attributes from extensions that people may have. Many people have also extended SCIM to define many things for IoT, password management, all sorts of things that are of local interest and found utility in that capability. Next slide. So Nick and I just whipped this up off the top of the head. There's not any strong data behind this, and it's controversial. I know, for example, there are deployments in excess of 50 million, if not a billion now in size. There are now over 65 implementations documented at simplecloud.info, and I suspect many more that haven't registered. You wouldn't expect many people who are building their own implementation for their own purpose to necessarily register unless they were sharing it. So these are open source implementations that are available. And I think Nick made a guess as to how many users and API servers might have. So that's where I'll leave it. I think if there are any questions on the history, I can help you with that, but I think I'll give the rest of the time back.
So then I guess that puts us into our second section, body of work. I don't remember offhand who's presenting that bit. Let me flip back to the agenda slide. Do we have a Lanzi or a Peterson here? Matt Peterson, okay. There you are. Body of work, back to that. Carry on.
All right, thanks so much, Phil. I think you did a great job of recapping where we've been, and Matt and I are here to talk a little bit about where we want to go. So if you go ahead and go to the next slide. Great. So as Phil did a fantastic job of laying out, the history behind SCIM, we want to drive things forward. There are definitely some new and emerging use cases that have come to life subsequent to SCIM 2.0. And as with any sufficiently complicated protocol, there's also a number of paper cuts with the existing use cases that various participants in the sessions we've had so far have raised up. So we really want to see if we can make some changes to the protocol or make some proposed changes to the protocol that would address some of those things. We also think that the 7643 and 7644 have now reached the level of maturity that they truly are internet standards. And so we want to drive that work forward as well. Phil just provided some great data around that from the Simple Cloud website, but both Matt and I have personal experience in having seen these very mature protocols implemented and used very broadly across enterprise use cases. So go ahead and next slide, please. There should be a next slide. There we go, perfect. So there's a couple of different...
Pressing the next button doesn't do it, so I had to do it again.
Oh, no problem. There's a couple of segments of work that we've talked about with all of these with the overall objective of moving these toward published RFCs so that the industry collectively can implement these various use cases in a standardized way. So the first one we'll talk about here is, I'm just going to name these off at a high level, and then Matt will take over and show you how you can help participate in this conversation. So the first one is around schemas. So schemas operating over certain domains of data and having some well-defined schemas around that, we think is one of the things that might be useful. One of the schemas being HR information. With respect to privacy, we need to keep those considerations in mind, but also exchanging enterprise group information and things like privilege access data as well. There are a number of pagination drafts that Matt will talk about here in a second. He's actually the author of one of them. And then some synchronization related functionality, best practices for the use of an external ID that exists in the SCIM spec today, privilege access management more broadly. And then of course, we want to be open to thinking about things that we've missed. So we have lots of really smart folks participating in the conversation so far, but it's very possible we don't have a monopoly on good thinking when it comes to SCIM. And so we want to be made aware if there's any other pain points or emerging use cases out there that we haven't already thought of or discussed. Next slide. Go ahead, Matt. We can't hear you. At least I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Now can you hear me?
Yes. All
right. So I've pasted into chat the URL that you see on the slide. It's just a really simple collaboration app that's called Padlet. And if you go to that URL, you should see something that looks very similar to the screenshot that you see on this slide. And I'm going to switch over and talk to the Padlet. So hopefully everyone can just open another tab in their browser and go to that URL. And you should see something very similar to what's on this slide here.
Would like to share your screen, you can do that. There's
okay. I will share this. I'll share my screen, and then those that can't get to Padlet for some reason can watch my screen.
Okay, I just clicked the grant screen.
Okay, so what?
This slide, oh, I have to stop sharing this. So hang on
Oh.
a second. That. Okay. Now, grant screen. Okay, there you go.
Okay, I'm just going to see that. Do you really want? Yes, I do. Okay. Share. Okay, can you see the screen now? Oh, there's a very, okay, let me get off of that. Okay.
Yes.
Very meta there for a second, but now it looks
Yeah.
fine.
I love you. It's fabulous.
All right, so this first tile is just for people to, you can just, click the like button or, enter in a little message to see if it's working. Seems like a few people have tried this out already. But if you want to just check to see if it's working and responding to your mouse clicks and typing, you can do that. While people are doing that, the first question that we wanted to ask is just kind of a general, question about, are there improvements that we need to make by rechartering the SCIM work group? Really simple question. I don't really think we need too much commentary there unless you're really interested in writing something, because there will be an opportunity later to add some comments about specific areas of interest. I added a couple of additional questions here about, who's already implemented SCIM. I'm already using it because it was a good interoperability standard for me. And then another tile, I don't use SCIM at all, but I would use it if there's something in particular that it had that I need for my use case. Right, so those are just kind of our general questions, and the meat of what we want to talk about here are some of these interest areas that came up in the interest group. So this is just a series of meetings that we've had prior to this BOF, and also some discussions on the mailing list. And we've tried to categorize those into just general areas, as Paul explained earlier. The first one is just kind of a general area of schema. How many people would be interested in just additional kind of standard information that you can get through SCIM? Things that have come up have been like HR information, enterprise groups. There's things about enterprise groups that are maybe important, maybe owners of groups, a description of a group, something that needs to be standardized in a way that is interoperable. Another example is authentication data, like what kind of authentication types are available, maybe certificates and keys for users. So if you have interest in schemas, now's your chance to vote for that. And if you have a specific schema that you're interested in, just add a comment there. Second little card here is about pagination. And pagination and synchronization related functionality, these may be might actually be a little bit related, and I'll explain in a second. But just generally, pagination is about receiving large result sets in an efficient way, a way that's both efficient for the server and also the client. We feel like we need to understand what the use cases are for pagination. A really good example is maybe I want to get all the members of a group, and that talks to multi-valued attributes, can be very large. Do we need to page those, or is there another way that we can go about handling that same use case and not need pagination for that use case? I'll segue to synchronization functionality, because one situation that seems to require pagination is a common pattern that we see in implementation, where a SCIM client wants to keep a copy of objects that they retrieved from SCIM local to the application for whatever reason. And then they want to keep that copy up to date with changes that are being made on the provisioning domain that the SCIM service provider is in front of. And this synchronization use case seems to be really popular for identity management systems, or possibly for applications that need the ability to enforce authorization based off of changes that are being made from objects that they've retrieved using SCIM. That could be groups, group memberships, and users. The really difficult scenario is, of course, when users are deleted or group memberships are removed. That's an important scenario that often requires a large amount of data, at least in the current spec, to be transferred in order to detect deletions. And that's where pagination comes in. How do I page through all of those results? So if you're interested in either of those topics, give it a heart. And if you have any specific comments, comment on those. In RFC 7643, there's a section on external ID. And this is a kind of an interesting scenario where we want to learn what people are doing with external ID. This can be really confusing, I think, for some implementers. Like, what should I use for external ID? What should I expect back for external ID? And you know, it's basically, you can read it here. I won't read the RFC, but take a second and read what external ID is. And if you've implemented a SCIM client or a SCIM service, you probably have a memory of having read this and maybe some questions. Could we clarify that? Do we need external ID? I think that's an interesting conversation. Last one here in our list of categories is there's a draft about privileged access management. This is specific for using SCIM to manage fine-grained access to privileged sessions or privileged passwords, privileged credentials, and also using SCIM to grant access to those same resources. And would like to know what kind of interest there is, or is this something that you know, maybe SCIM wouldn't be as good for as some other protocol. But there is a draft for privileged access management, and would like to know if that's something that we should pursue. And I guess the last one is you know, this some other interest category, and we hope that we get some feedback in here, and if we have time, maybe hear some people talk about interests that they have. I don't know how far ahead or behind we are on our schedule, but there certainly would be some time or would be some interest in hearing what people have to say, if maybe there's something they want to say that takes too long to type. So I don't know if how we are doing on our schedule, but if you know, if there's something happening, I'm going to not share my screen so I can see what's going on in comments.
Yeah, Matt, just to reflect a couple things I saw in the comments here. So Bob, thank you very much for raising the question around IoT. If IoT was mentioned in the introduction, it may have been either me or someone else misspeaking. We hadn't thought particularly about IoT as a use case around SCIM, but I think having sat through the Danish session the other day around bringing Dane authentication to IoT devices, I think there could be some interesting ways in which SCIM might be able to help with that. So thanks for raising that question. Though, as I added in the chat, I am a newbie when it comes to understanding Dane, so I may not be the best person to answer that one. And then, yeah, anything else in the chat here that I saw? Matt, anything else you're seeing here in the chat?
No, I'm not seeing anything.
And anyone should feel free to raise your hand and get in the queue if there's anything you want to say or ask.
Oh, thanks, Phil, for clarifying. Yes, you had mentioned privately extending for IoT for their own use. Yeah, no standards work so far. Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a couple of comments on the Padlet that if we have time, I'd like to hear someone talk about. Someone mentioned in the Padlet about currently we're very restricted to groups, and any provisioning of these groups to entitlements in the targets is not possible. Can whoever wrote that maybe talk a little bit about what they meant there? You'd have to get in the queue by unmuting your mic.
Go ahead, Rajesh. Hear you. If you're, are you still muted? Maybe. Okay, I don't hear anything from Rajesh. Does anyone
Okay.
else? No. Okay.
If we and Rajesh, if you're able to speak, please do so. Just to guess a little bit at what they might have been getting at here. You know, some of the schema work that that Matt talked about, the sort of the very top one here in the Padlet, talks about taking information of various kinds, potentially including entitlement data, and figuring out how to exchange that in a standard way between systems using SCIM. So the SCIM PAM spec, which Matt mentioned, is an example of taking entitlement data and pushing that back and forth between the two systems. Extending that and generalizing that is something that's also envisioned as potentially being part of the work here. Anything to add to that?
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, there you are. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's exactly right. So we have different target applications. Like, let's take example of AWS, right? AWS provisioning, they support users and groups because that is restricted to SCIM. But then any role assignments within AWS, which grants different resource entitlements for those users, which can be either associated to the users or the groups, that has to be done through an API, right? And for that, there is no SCIM, and that is just one example, right? And there are many other entitlements that are being provisioned out into different applications, like for EBS, Oracle EBS, there are roles and responsibilities and so on and so forth. So I'm just trying to see, why is this only restricted just to users and groups? As we extend that beyond provisioning of just these roles, we should also be able to provision entitlements as well as part of the SCIM payload.
Okay.
Does this make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's, we'll figure out a way of summarizing that and adding it in. Darren McAdams mentioned something in the Padlet about clarity in how to represent reference attributes, such as the manager attribute and enterprise user, which point to other resources in the SCIM service, which would be like maybe another user that's the manager. We've noted inconsistencies across implementations. Darren, would you mind commenting on the inconsistencies you've seen and what you think we could do to fix that?
Yeah, I'm not going to remember all the details off the top of my head, but it's sort of like, do you put I think the spec didn't quite say what you should put in there. Should it be the username, the external ID? And so you kind of see,
or the ID.
Yeah, or the ID. So you sort of see people making their best guess. So I think it's some missing best practices guidance, perhaps, or some profiling, or just some way to sort of get some consensus on how to handle those things.
Okay.
It's also in the queue. I don't know, Phil, if you want.
Yeah, Phil, go ahead. You're in the queue. Go ahead and talk.
That SCIM only defines a couple of objects, as I mentioned on the earlier part of the presentation, but that wasn't intended to restrict it to those objects. People are free to define whatever schema they want. And then you have the IANA process to register that if you choose to do so. And also the working group process, which we're here for today, if you want to do it even wider. So I think it has to depend on how widely you want that schema to be supported. There is something that's come up with entitlements. Both SCIM defines roles on the user object that can be used and groups. And there were very basic definitions for SCIM 2. I've heard a lot of requests that I want things like, customers want things like expiry dates and other metadata around membership in a group or a role, so that entitlements can expire and have a life cycle all on their own. It increases complexity, but I can understand the complexity for implementers, because if it's not appearing in the SCIM service, it has to go elsewhere. One of the technical problems we can talk about is, how would you extend a sub-attribute of an existing object like a group to add such metadata? Because there really isn't a mechanism right now to do that. Or would you just define a new group like an enterprise group, and the enterprise group carries all the metadata, the new metadata. And I think that's a topic worth discussing. Sometimes the ugly one, a new group type, is ugly, but it's easiest to implement because people just add the object and off you go. So I'll leave that to the group. So just adding those to the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, Pamela.
I mean, speaking to both of these comments about schema, the other thing that we get to do if we can bring these new schema extensions to the forefront is we can do interoperability testing, right? And so I think there's both a reliability advantage to that kind of interoperability testing once we can get some profiles done, but also there's a security attribute, security piece here that I think is important. So for example, if we look at the HR schema, right, that HR data is flying around now. It's just flying around in ways that are proprietary. So, I believe there's an advantage to, making the requirements around sending that kind of data more rigorous so that we can apply better rules, especially to areas where we know there are important security or privacy, requirements, right? It means the entire group is examining the API and choosing the best combination to fit security and privacy needs. So that would just be one additional point to consider.
Okay. Hey, I'm curious. I don't know how many people are in the queue, but on the Padlet, we had one for I'm not using SCIM, but I would if it handled my use case better. I'm curious about what that use case is.
Put that into, if you put that in, please just unmute and speak up.
Yeah. Or if you don't want to, you can hide, I guess.
Yeah, if you don't want to, that's okay.
Or type it into the Padlet, then you'll be anonymous.
There you go. So, okay, is there more we need to talk about here, or should we go ahead and get into the next item, which is the proposed charter?
Just that we'll leave the Padlet open, and so if thoughts occur to you later on, feel free to revisit the Padlet at the next meeting of the folks that have been meeting to put this together. We'll also take a look at the updated Padlet. So if more thoughts occur to you, please add them there.
Okay, so clickable in the slides if you downloaded them, and displayed on your screen here is the link to the charter. And Pamela is going to lead us through a charter review. So go ahead, Pamela.
Yes, and I do have the text of the charter on a slide that we can look at in 1 second, just so that people can take the time to go through it. It's not very long, but these are some of the desired outcomes that we spoke of in our bi-weekly meetings about why we think a SCIM recharter is valuable. So we do think that we can help adoption by clarifying some of the concepts, right? It's not that the concepts were bad in the beginning, it's that the world was kind of a different place at that time. And so what we can do now is cast some of those, for example, use cases and concepts that are in the use cases and concepts guide into language that's just more consumable for people today. The other piece that there has been a ton of discussion about is paper cuts. So the small things that are preventing people from easily connecting, that's another outcome we think we can really affect, which is to take all of this accumulated knowledge of all these implementations and all of these implementers and apply that knowledge. And then there is a question of optimization as well. So now that the cloud is a humming place since 2012, and there's a lot of understanding around developer environments and developer, how developers work, how clients work. Can we apply those to make things more performant as well? And then the last one, of course, is security-wise. Can we up the level of security by default? Can we give people better security guidance given our current world and our current breach response? And feel free to raise your hand to comment at any point. So this is the actual charter. It is the same charter that is in the link. So if you don't want to type that long link, you can just take a read through it. I'm thinking to just give maybe 2 minutes for folks to read. Is that, Barry, Nancy, is that okay to do that?
It works for me.
Okay.
I suppose if I had the Jeopardy music recorded, I could play that. That would give us 30 seconds anyway. So.
Perfect. All right. If you would help us know when we're in good shape to done. Maybe when people are done, they can start commenting in the comments so we know when to move forward.
So I don't know if we have speed readers around, but I'll ask if people need more time, just say something in the chat. Otherwise, we will move on. I don't see anybody yelling for extra time in the chat, so let's go ahead and start running through anything we need to here.
Okay, perfect. So, so the first thing that we cover here, and I think if you go to the next slide, Barry, I think there's a sort of a breakdown, but I could be wrong. Right. So the real question here, there's a lot of things we could do, and there's a lot of really great proposals on, for drafts. Some of them have been around for a very long time. Some of them are already well implemented. So the question becomes, what do we do first, and how do we, unfold a working group successfully? So, these are the things that, the group has discussed around what to do. Obviously, we want as much feedback as possible. And Barry, Nancy, I don't know if it's worth mentioning this, but this BOF has been set up as a non-work group forming BOF. However, we want this charter to be mature. We're hoping to take steps immediately to do a work group forming based on the feedback from everyone here. So, we're really hoping for as much feedback as we can get. So, so ultimately, these are the work items. Oh, I see Roman. Do you want to make a comment, Roman?
I wanted to quickly comment on working group forming, non-working group kind of forming. Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of kind of a nuance and kind of finesse. If we can get strong support here behind the charter that we're about to talk about, that'll be a great signal kind of for me. We'll want to take it to the mailing list for confirmation, but that is going to be more than enough if we can demonstrate strong interest here from the text you present and on the mailing list confirming that. We don't need anything more to potentially proceed to chartering with the ISG for the first pass. Thanks.
Okay, great. So let's just go through sort of the work items. We have to slice and dice. We have to give a plan, right, of where we want our milestones to be. So, the first milestone that we have up is documenting, changing the language to be more modern, right? So talking more about use cases where there could be, for example, SCIM proxying, or where you have two cloud service providers talking to each other versus talking to a SaaS app that might be, a leaf node, if you will. So we want to really make it clean, and we want to make it easy for people who adopt to understand which role they would naturally fall into, right? Are they pushing data? Are they pulling data, right? All of these sort of ideas of you can be a SCIM client or a SCIM server, and you can push or you can pull. And so there's actually two axes, right? Are you a SCIM client that's pushing? Are you a SCIM client that pulls, et cetera? So that's really that first work item. The second one is to look at the core specification and to understand what, if anything, we need to change about that core specification. So, this certainly means a security review, talking about, have we put enough metadata? Is there enough in the schema of the metadata to be able to actually create the, to specify, for example, which OAuth paradigm, how to get an OAuth key, for example. Those kinds of bits and pieces are what we're looking at. And of course, in this case, this is where we're looking at the paper cuts. We're getting the implementer feedback. We're really looking at where the pain is here so that we can eliminate it. The third item is the schema workshopping. And, I think the assumption is that this could parallelize in some cases, depending on how much interest we have in the group. So, different schema work will have different participants, we're assuming, but won't really know until we start to get people signing up. But the assumption is that some of these schema extensions will be very popular and will have very specialized participants. And then the next one is extension breakouts. And because we have so many drafts already in place, right, we will have to make some choices about what happens first. We don't want to split the conversation so much up that we fragment and nobody can get anything done because there's too many things happening at once. So, that work item has to involve choosing choosing the right options to go first, and then creating a streamlined plan for how we work through all of the things that the working group has appetite for. And then last but not least is interrupt testing. So we are really hoping that, the whole reason why we want this thing to become simpler yet more formalized is so that we can then, make sure the interoperability tests occur so that in the future, implementers don't have to guess, that they can really easily see their role, understand the role they can play, understand the extensions and what they'll do for them, and run some tests to know if they're going to be successful or not. So that's what I have for charter review. Hopefully I can turn it over to the amazing chairs who can, help us get all of your comments.
Are there any questions or comments about the charter, including comments saying the charter looks great, let's move forward? And anything is open right now. So Leif.
Let's see if this works.
It does.
Yeah.
So the schema issue, it feels kind of dangerous because from what I've seen, implementations typically do a lot of private schema, and something like an HR schema, it feels like something we could really get bogged down in details, and people have different conceptions of what constitutes an employee, etc., etc. The information modeling in there is going to be pretty difficult, I think. I would be very careful sort of taking on that kind of work. Even things like enterprise groups that I've heard mentioned here seems like it's full of sort of hidden conceptions and sort of assumptions about what a group should be and not be. So I would, I think it would be better to spend time trying to figure out ways to make SCIM implementations less schema dependent, or at least sort of more schema agnostic or more schema aware, depending on what you want, how you want to. So, if I buy a SCIM product, make sure that I can load schema through SCIM. Make sure that SCIM products are in fact interoperable, regardless of the schema I load into them, and then let people define whatever schema they need for their applications.
Do you imagine a world where the attributes are standardized, but not the combinations of attributes?
No, I think I'm imagining a world where I can actually buy a SCIM implementation or a SaaS provider and then dump my schema onto it and make it work in a standardized way. In my community, in the research and education community, there are like tons of schema that's sort of been widely deployed, and has been around for a long time. It's never going to get like IETF standardized, and it will never get sort of picked up by any of the major vendors, right? But when we go buy products, we would like those schema to be have at least a fighting chance to be deployable on standard products. So having like less hardwired schema in SCIM products, I guess, would be my preference, instead of trying to come up with the smallest common denominator for HR schema. That feels like a waste of time to me.
Yeah, that's great feedback.
Other comments? I'd like to hear if anyone thinks that a working group along these lines should not be chartered. I'd like to hear that.
Barry, before we get to that, do you guys hear me?
Yeah, we
Yes.
can hear you.
Before we get to that, I have one more question for Pam, because I'm a little bit confused. So some of these things, so I heard two things. One is sort of moving the SCIM spec into standard, and then the other part is some of the extensions and changes. And I'm not quite sure which one is the priority, whether compatibility between SCIM 2.0 and whatever work comes out is requirement. Like how are those things compare? And also on the last sort of slide that we were looking at, the synchronization stuff wasn't listed. And having been involved with, for some of you guys that are old enough to remember LDUP, the LDAP replication working group, we spent years working on it, and it ended up sort of going nowhere. So how much do we want to work on that in synchronization? How much the team wants to sort of focus on the synchronization, and whether that's part of that sort of requirement or sort of focus going forward?
My thought was that this will come as part of sort of profiling the roles and talking about the original roles. But you're absolutely right. There's tension, and I believe has always been tension between essentially participants who want to use SCIM as essentially a database, a database interface, and who need that database to be, who basically need to be able to do things like queries. But there's also folks who want to use it for loosely coupled provisioning. And there's a question of how tight does the synchronization have to be between the client and the server? What are those mechanisms? So that, for example, what you're talking about really is the proposal to do like changelog tracking. I don't think we came to a consensus in the run-up to this working group on what kind of work. That was a topic, but not a topic that ran to the top of the flagpole. But if there's anyone else in the group that would like to state more about that.
Phil next in the queue, and then Leif. So let's have them comment. Go ahead, Phil.
I did want to address the synchronization thing. I think at this point, what we need is there's a number of synchronization, signals, coordination items that have been on our plate for a long time. I think we're not ready to actually work on solid concepts yet. I think what we really need is a strong use case document. So I'm not sure how the charter at this point maybe could only really call for, I think, would be a use case document that describes the requirements. And I think it needs to be discussed also for another reason, because I see people trying to use paging and calling for stateful paging as a poor man's solution to synchronization. That is very concerning because it's a costly way to do things. It means you're dumping all the data every synchronization cycle. So if you're paying for bytes of transfer and the risk, any kind of coordination or synchronization approach to me means dealing with change events only or security events only. And so I do think it's worth building a consensus first on what is the problem. And then I think a subsequent charter then could say, we know what the problem is, this is what we need to do. And I think that might be definable. It's still a hard problem. So, take what Morteza said as an important comment, that LDUP is, we've been here before. Thanks again.
Dave? Leif, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, LDUP, let's not do that again. What I would like to add, though, is that I think there is a credible sort of story around notification, maybe basing it on the identity events, sort of something that looks like security events or identity events, and then sort of not going for synchronization, but going for change notification instead, which removes a lot of the problems around authorization of data associated with synchronization, not to mention sort of multi-master sync protocols that we all know and love. So I think maybe rewriting the charter to say that we will look for notification mechanisms, add notification mechanisms to SCIM in such a way that they can be used to build sort of poor man's synchronization. And then, go revisit the 0-day sync problem, which arguably can be done with paging.
Feel that that's a must-have for the initial flight of work, or is that something organically we can continue talking about if we had a working group and then we could recharter for it?
I mean, I think a lot of people are building versions of sync already, because it is something that you kind of need to do in so many situations. In our implementation, we found that we couldn't deal with all of the authorization problems, so we just sort of boiled it down to, or reduced the problem to notification or the synchronization. So I actually think it is kind of important to be able to deal with sort of fleets or collections of SCIM services like this, but we should try to do it in such a way that we don't get bogged down by sort of specters of protocols passed from the LDAP days.
Okay, I think I'm going to ping Cullen. Cullen, I presume you are covering this as an IAB observer. Do you have any comments or questions from that point of view?
No, I think that this was, a fairly good case has been made, so I've just been following along with it. I don't have any questions, but thank you.
All right, does anyone else have comments or questions? All right, I think we clearly have a critical mass of SCIM folks who want to proceed with this. I don't think I really need to ask do we have authors questions and stuff like that, because I think we have evidence of that from a number of drafts that are out there. And I've already asked the question of whether anyone would not want to see a working group along these lines chartered. So I think we have what we need for the BOF. Discussion of the charter and the work that's proposed will continue on the mailing list, which is scim@ietf.org. And what I would like to see, if this proceeds to a working group, is rather than having a working group with a new name, have the working group called SCIM rechartered with a fresh charter. Nancy, do you have any comments?
I think I'll just echo that. I would think that the next steps, Barry, I don't know if I'm undercutting you, but given that there's been enough discussion, it seems like the next step is to get the feedback, to get the charter more tightly clarified. I think Roman had mentioned the 2 steps of the body of work that we should be focusing on. So if people can look at the charter and think about what that body of work should be, is that well articulated there, or are there things that we need to remove? And then the second piece of that is how we prioritize it.
Yes. Yeah, and clearly that can go 2 ways. We can put in a first set of work and say that we're going to recharter to continue with other work, or we can just lay it all out in this charter, but put a priority on and say that this work will happen only after this initial work is complete. So that we can bash all that out on the mailing list, but let's proceed that way. We still have 5 minutes on this session, so if anyone else has something to say, please. I don't think you even need to get in the queue. We haven't had a long queue. Just unmute and say. And I'm seeing no one. Roman, is there anything else you think we need from this, or should we just wrap up?
No, I would have just first off thanked the proponents and the chairs for the immense amount of preparation you did in teeing up all of this material. And I think the conversation that was just had about next steps is exactly right. The charter appears to me to be relatively close. I think we need to talk about priority. There was some talk a little bit about, what role does notification and synchronization play out, and then we can handle all that in the mailing list, and we can do a confirmation and move from there. I think we're well positioned. Thank you.
And I'll repeat Roman's thanks to the proponents for being so organized and getting a good presentation and a good BOF set up here. And to my co-chairs for helping chair it. So,
Well, likewise.
See you all in GatherTown and other sessions.
And on the mail list.
And on the mailing list. Bye, everybody.
Pam, did you want to do a last?
I was just going to say thanks to the chairs for making it easy for us. We really appreciate your support.
You're welcome.
Hold on, before we leave, Cullen is asking, so the mail list, we should continue this on the SCIM mail list?
Yes,
As
I think that's
showing preference, yeah.
Yes, that's the right approach, SCIM@IETF.org.
Thank you, Cullen, and thank you, Paul, for putting it on the chat.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
All right, thank you, everyone.